And the microphone is very important. We're being live streamed tonight. So once we get into question and answer and discussion, please make sure that you have the microphone so folks who might be watching at home or want to watch later are able to hear your comments.
Thank you, Amy. Excuse me. Again, thanks for coming out and listening to us for a few minutes and then giving us feedback on the report and on the work. I do want to thank not just Amy, but also Mandy for making all the arrangements to make this happen, notifying people and making it possible. There's copies of the report in the back of the room if you'd like that, or you can also just go to the website and download it. If there's things you want to say but you don't get to say them tonight, feel free to email us anytime between now and the 1st of August before we make final revisions. This is a draft. Let's see. As most of you know, this is our second report this year. There's 4 reports quarterly that we're putting out. The first one is about the Police Bureau's response to mental health crises, which covered sections 5 and 6 of the settlement agreement. This second report focuses on use of force, and that's section 3 of the agreement. And there will always be some overlap between these sections because there are certain themes that run throughout the settlement agreement about mental health and about force, and so there will be some degree of integration and overlap and repetition of concepts. There will be 4 reports. Each one gives attention to particular topics, as I've suggested. That the third quarterly report will focus on training in the Bureau, and that's section 4 of the settlement agreement, and as well on their employee information system, which is section 7. The fourth and final report will focus on officer accountability, which is section 8, and community engagement, which is section 9. So in practice, what this means for us is we're doing our best to provide a critical analysis of the progress that the Bureau and the city have made in each of these areas and give them some focused guidance and technical assistance about what remains to be done to achieve substantial compliance with the terms of the settlement agreement. So I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Tom Kristoff, my colleague here, who will give you a brief overview of the latest report on use of force by PPB officers and the status of their compliance with the terms of the settlement agreement. So Tom, if you can do that, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions after that. And if there's a point of clarification or something, though, don't hesitate to ask him what it means at that moment. We just don't want to get through his presentation, and then we can move on. Okay, thanks, Tom.
So with our overall assessment that's found in the draft report, we found 4 out of 13 paragraphs within the use of force section where PPB and the city, we feel, have substantially complied with the requirements. This leaves 9 of 13 paragraphs, all of which substantial compliance has not been reached, but there are certain conditions, finite tasks left for PPB and the city to accomplish that we feel would bring them into substantial compliance. So we'll go through some of those things, as well as look at our evaluation of whether the implementation of the settlement agreement has created systems for management of force as required by paragraph. It used to be 173 with the revision to the settlement agreement. It's 170 now. So we'll look at 2 main parts of the systems. Their force audit, which we believe is a positive system for evaluating the use of force, and second, data evaluation, and we'll discuss some of the trends that were identified through our evaluation of the data. In terms of compliance, there are some policy paragraphs requiring PPB to revise their policy and implement those policy revisions. We've noted a number of positive steps with regards to this section. One of them is the de-escalation of force, and we'll talk. We talk a little bit in our report about how the de-escalation of force is different from force avoidance using verbal de-escalation techniques. But we have found that when PPB uses force and the subject lowers their resistance or stops resisting altogether, that the de-escalation of the force does occur. We've also noted PPB has been able to refrain from force against those who are in custody or who express verbal discontent with an officer. Report writing is the reports put out by PPB officers and the after-action reports that are put together by supervisors demonstrate a high level of detail. You're able to read it and get a complete picture of the event, allowing supervisors in the chain of command to review those force events and have enough information in there to be able to review them. As we note, there's the verbal de-escalation. We've still seen in the first quarter cases that we reviewed that there's appears to be some misunderstanding of verbal de-escalation. In the last month or two, the inspector has put out some documents that clarifies the difference between command and control tactics, and that those are not de-escalation, and what verbal de-escalation more looks like. This was also reinforced through the spring in-service training for officers and supervisors. And one other area that we've seen positive steps has been a feedback loop. For those of you who have read our prior reports, things that were identified by the supervisor, things that were identified by the inspector, did not have a formal feedback loop to ensure that those concerns were addressed. PPB has implemented that feedback loop. Areas of policy that work still needs to occur. I discussed the verbal de-escalation training and the documents that were released by the inspector. Those are fairly new documents. Those are fairly new training. So we have to see that translates to on the street behavior of officers. We also noted a concern with the supervisor's evaluation of the Graham standard, as well as a provision within 1010 that says that you have to have exigent circumstances to use 3 or more CEW applications. There was, it appears to be an interpretation issue of whether it's an application if the probe does not deliver an electric current. We feel that this is a potential policy implication that needs to be addressed by PPB. We also noted some deficiency in how EIS entries are made. When a supervisor identifies that a officer maybe needs a debrief, when a supervisor identifies deficiencies in officer report writing, these things are required to be put into EIS, and our review of the EIS entries found that this was not consistently done. Also, one last thing is handcuffing between CEW cycles. PPB has made progress in terms of buying a dummy that can be used in training for officers to practice the skill. We had noted that this was discussed in training a number of times, but officers hadn't had that ability to practice their skill. The dummy has been used in the Advanced Academy, and will not be used for in-service until this upcoming fall. So there is a plan in place.
Same with CEW.
I'm sorry, CEW is conducted electrical weapon, a taser. So there's, PPB now has the ability to do practice of handcuffing between CEW cycles in the fall in service, but again, because it hasn't occurred yet, it still needs to happen. We also looked at paragraphs 74, 75, and 77, which is the force audit. Overall, we've seen large-scale progress in how PPB has put together the force audit, how they have included all the focal points in their force audit methodology. We looked at phase 1 of the force audit, as we've been calling it, which looks to see whether all of the information required to facilitate a comprehensive review by the supervisor is included in force reports. We'll get into the numbers a bit later on in the presentation. However, the information is present in there, and we conducted an independent evaluation to see whether we agreed with the inspector's coding, and we found that there was large-scale agreement with whether the information was present. Phase 2 of the force audit looks to see whether the inspector's independent review of a supervisor's investigation of the use of force, their findings of whether there was any potential policy violations. We also conducted an independent evaluation of phase 2 and found that we believe that the inspector has demonstrated an ability to make findings outside of what the chain of command supervisor. It's an independent evaluation rather than just checking the box. And then also, we've seen trend evaluation with the force audit data and the results. Like I discussed, there's a feedback loop in place when there's deficiency. There's a feedback deficiency in report writing. There's a feedback loop in place when there is debrief needed. Though, again, the execution of this still needs to be evaluated because it's a relatively new advancement. We also looked at PPB's evaluation of force trends. This is done in a couple of ways. One of them is through an applications of force report that PPB uses. We include in our report that we feel that there's some methodological improvements that could be made. However, the framework and the approach that PPB is taking, we believe is in line with the settlement agreement and commendable compared with prior years. The next one is force audit reports, again, of looking at trends found through that data and seeing where that can be organizationally useful and how that can be improved.
Tell them what a force audit is, basically.
So the force audit is it's basically this previous slide that I discussed, the phase 1 of making sure all the information is included to evaluate a use of force, as well as the phase 2 of the inspector's findings.
And there's a group of folks there.
And there's a group of analysts who are competent in doing analysis and coding, yes. We also discussed the correct and duplicate when trends are found. If there are trends that demonstrate a positive direction, there is an ability of the inspector, there's a pathway through the feedback loop to duplicate that elsewhere. Where there are deficiencies found, that feedback loop is able to correct. That was obviously a quick go through of a 70-something page report. Also, the second half of this report looks at the systems, and like I said, there's two large-scale things. One of them is the force audit. Like I said before, two main focal points: sufficiency of information present. PPB is able to look at the rate of deficiencies, bureau-wide as well as by precinct, categories of deficiencies, and our report covers the findings from that, as well as the review of the inspector, the phase 2 evaluations. So in regards to the phase 1, is there information there? We look at reporting deficiencies per force event. Bureau-wide, I don't have a laser, but if you can see within the 2018 quarter 1, officers had a 1.43 reporting deficiencies per FDCR. And it should be noted that there are over 100 areas of review that the analysts look at. So out of over 100 points of review, officers normally, on average, are deficient in 1.43 areas. This is a very low number. We also note that the sergeants have reduced their number of deficiencies per after action. The lieutenants, RU managers, and chief's office also enjoy a low rate of deficiencies per force event. And taken all together, there is the information that is required by the settlement agreement and that is required in order for supervisors to evaluate a force event are within the reports. The officers are including them and the sergeants are including them in their after actions. The inspector points of review, this is the phase 2 findings. Report writing is an overall metric of whether the report writing completely, or not completely missed the mark, but whether there was a substantial deficiency in the officer's report writing, whether they left out something that was important or whether there was a number of smaller points. This was the most often found deficiency by the inspector. This is the quarter 1, 2018 quarter 1 phase 2 findings. Use of force, there was concern with use of force in only 4 of 123 events. But I mean, as you can see, the inspectors found positive evaluations in over 95% of most cases. The next thing that we looked at in the report is overall force data from PPB. Our report covers a wide range of force data. For this presentation here, we're going to focus on a couple of select findings, but we would refer you to the full report for all of the force evaluation and trends that we looked at. The first one is force data overall. Has force gone up or down since the second quarter of 2015? And the reason we chose the second quarter of 2015 was there's a switch in the records management system. So in order to have consistent data and have comparable data, the second quarter of 2015 was the best starting point. As you can see, the number of cases involving FDCR, these are events, were under 200 all the way up until the third quarter of 2017, and I'll discuss a little bit why those numbers went up. Frequency of force is that green line, that is the FDCRs. If you look at the quarter 3, you will see an increase, and the reason for this is because in that quarter, the Portland Police Bureau revised their Directive 1010, which expanded the number of actions by an officer that would be considered force. One example, and as you can see in the report, it's a large reason, is resisted handcuffing. That in prior times was not considered a use of force. Because it is now considered a reportable use of force, the overall force numbers have gone up. That should not be looked at as PPB is using force more often. It's just that PPB expanded the types of actions that they are considering reportable force. This is the proportion of all force that CEWs, the tasers, make up. As you can see, in the third quarter of 2016 was when it hit its high mark at a little bit over 10% of all uses of force. Again, when you look at the quarter 3, quarter 4, and quarter 1 at the end of the chart, that should be looked at as because the force expanded, the proportion went down. But even prior to that time, it ranged between 5 and 10%. This is the force to custody ratio. Again, fairly consistent between the second quarter of 2015 and the first quarter of 2017. We do see that increase starting in the third quarter of 2017 because more force was more force types were being collected. It increased the number of force events that were being recorded, and as a ratio of custody, it caused that force to custody ratio to go up. But it still remains under 5%, even with that expansion of force types collected. This is the force data on the call types. I'll go through this. I just want to point out that disturbance priority is consistently one of the highest, the most often call type associated with uses of force. Excuse me. As well as traffic stops, but particularly the disturbance priority being consistently the highest. And we're gonna go technical a little bit on here, so I'm hoping we try to explain this in the report. We employed two multivariate analyses. So I'll discuss a little bit what a multivariate analysis is compared with a bivariate analysis, and then try to give kind of a background before going into those numbers. So a common example of correlation, two variables, a bivariate, is that as ice cream sales go up, homicide rates go up. You see this in every city. You can create a very good correlation between the sales of ice cream and homicide. But that doesn't mean that ice cream sales are related to homicide. There is a third variable, that the weather. As the weather gets warmer, ice cream sales go up. As the weather gets warmer, people are outside more, homicide rates go up. To only look at the bivariate it gives an idea of where to look further, but you need to employ a multivariate thing that includes other contributing factors and that controls for them. Basically, if all other things were equal, what is the relationship between these two variables? It provides for a more complete picture of actual use of force. And I hope I didn't confuse. I'll let you undo the confusion.
So this is the beginning of looking at factors that may be contributing to the use of force and the seriousness of force in Portland. And to take Tom's example further, if you add additional variables into the equation between ice cream and homicide, in particular you add the weather or this month of the year, you will see that the relationship between ice cream and homicide disappears in the equation. Ice cream no longer is associated with homicide when you control for the effects of weather, okay? So that's why it's important. With force, it's the same thing. There's lots of things that may contribute to force, and we're trying to pin that down a little bit in Portland here so we can help you. If you can look at factors that are contributing, maybe some of them are controllable, preventable, et cetera, and possibly reduce the levels of force. So we went into the data, looked at all the data, and here's what Tom is going to say a few words about.
So we ran two analyses. The first one, and again, I apologize for the terminology. The first one is a binary logistic regression. That means that the dependent variable is two things, and we look at
Force is two things.
Correct. So we looked at whether a person is more likely to receive a level 4 use of force category compared to categories 2 and 3 as the first force that is used by the officer.
We should say that the categories of force are groupings that we haven't really talked about. They're new categories in the Bureau, but essentially it's the reverse of what you'd think. 4 is the least serious, generally speaking. And so it's comparing kind of what factors predict more or less use of force. We don't have a control group here of no force. This is just of all the force cases. Is there certain things that predict whether force is a more higher level of force is used or not, or less serious force?
There's a couple of results here that, to be able to read our report, the odds ratio. So you can see that active resistance compared with passive resistance, passive resistance is the reference. if you were displaying active resistance, you were 5 times more likely to receive the higher level of force category compared with passive resistance. Aggressive or deadly resistance, you are more than 18 times more likely to receive a higher category of force than passive resistance. On the flip side, verbal calming and used barriers and one-on-one communication, these are de-escalation techniques. The odds ratio, the odds of receiving a higher use of force, you are 95% less likely to receive a higher use of force, or for the officer to use a higher use of force when the officer has employed one of these de-escalation tactics.
And the chances of finding these differences just by chance alone are less than 1 in 1,000.
No.
Just to put it in some perspective, in case you think that this is just random fluctuation in the data.
The next evaluation we did was an ordinal logistic regression, and this looks at Category 4 compared to Category 3, and then Category 3 compared to Category 2. Again, if you look at active resistance, 86% more likely to receive a higher category of force, and this is overall use of force throughout the entire event. The logistic one was just the officer's first application of force. The subject being disobedient or antagonistic is 8.68 times more likely to receive a higher level of force. So when you're looking at what contributes to a subject receiving a higher category of force, the biggest ones consistently in both this regression was the level of resistance, the deliberately disobedient antagonistic, and as well as in this one, 6.18 for aggressive deadly resistance. Deliberately antagonistic is 8.68 times more likely. So when you're looking at what explains higher categories of force, these ones consistently come up as being the higher the better explanation.
Well, let me just, for those of you that are, I don't know what your level of knowledge is on this stuff, but essentially, those kinds of variables are generally considered consistent with policy and with the constitutional standard of the Graham standard, that you're justified in using force at the level of resistance that you receive, and various other factors, the seriousness of and the deadliness of the resistance. So those things make sense. They shouldn't be a big surprise. It suggests that officers are using that kind of decision-making and judgment within a legal and constitutional framework. Some of the other variables, though, are a little more problematic. There are demographic differences here, showing that even after you control for resistance and whether the person is armed, et cetera, that blacks and Latinos are more likely to receive a higher level of force, and males as well. And some of the other techniques are effective. But so there are some issues there. Let's see, what the previous one, where is the?
This one?
Yeah. There is a 34% more likely that if you're transient, you're more likely to receive a higher level of force than if you're not.
That's on the first application. This is
That's only on the first application of force, not the overall. So there are some areas that can we explain these? Not necessarily. All we ask is the Bureau and the city and others in the community try to look more carefully at this and try to explain them. And there probably are explanations. Some may be legal and justified, some may be not. But that's the kind of stuff that we're just bringing up that we want you to pay attention to.
So, I mean, overall, the takeaways from the two regressions, I think one of the bigger takeaways, particularly as it relates to the settlement agreement, in neither of the regressions was mental illness a significant predictor of the level of force that a person would receive, either overall or as the first force application by an officer. Other potential contributors did show up, primarily the presence of a weapon, the level of resistance, disobedient, antagonistic to the officer was another one. However, there are some other contributors, some demographic effects have been shown. The takeaway that comes from that is we believe PPB should undertake such sophisticated data analyses to identify the trends. We also note here that it is the analysts that are working in the professional standards division are very capable of doing this. They have been able to run some of these more sophisticated analyses themselves. There is some constraints with the resources that they have and the other activities that the analysts are undertaking. It takes time. It takes a lot of effort to do these types of analyses, and the analysts have other things that they're doing with force trends. So they have the ability. There just may be some resource issues with that. I've got one more slide with the conclusions, and then I'll take you, Philip. Is that okay? Okay. So just in conclusion from the entire thing, in regards to compliance with the particular paragraphs, there's some commendable progress that is being made. There are some issues that remain, but there is the progress. With the systems, the force audit, we believe, is functioning well overall. We've, through our own independent evaluation of it, we're satisfied that it acts as a system of force management. The data demonstrates that mental illness is not a predictor of what force category you're going to use, but there are other areas that remain that PPB should review and look at. And
I just want to make one comment, then I'll open it up, that, there are a few troubling statistics in here, but I think it's important. We've had a lot of hours in the Bureau and on the street to get to, and in the data to get to the bottom of these things. And generally, I said this before, Judge Simon, I'll say it one more time here, that I feel there's kind of an exponential increase in the level of compliance that the Bureau is experiencing because for various forces, maybe things are just gelling after several years of pressure, internal and external, to do things. But I think the presence of a new police chief at this point in history is also helping significantly in that regard. It somehow just brings in new energy and new people and new positions, and I think that's contributing to this kind of movement toward getting compliance with a lot of these. So I just want to add that. Thank you. So let's open it up. I know, Philip, do you have a mic for?
Thank you for your comments. I do have a quick question about resources and the barriers to those resources. What kinds of things would help improve the system if those resources were in place? Can you go more into detail about what those resources would be?
I think the biggest thing would just be, if you're looking at the force reports now, there's a lot of those bivariate evaluations. To be able to run the more sophisticated models, to be able to look at the data, collect it, code it in a way that you can really run these sophisticated analyses and create reports based on that, I think would go a long way.
Right, I agree with that. I think they probably could use another analyst that is devoted to that kind of work entirely. These other analysts are very talented, but they're very busy analyzing every single force report and writing these audit reports and things like that. So,
And I would say, I mean, in analyzing the force reports, they're reading the reports, and not only reading it, but pulling out, like I said, over 100 variables, coding that, and then for the reports, and then on top of that, then looking for trends, then doing that type of evaluation. So you have them doing force application reports, you have them doing the force audit reports, just the quarterly force reports as well. There's a lot on their plate, and they can do these types of analysis though, but based on the reports that they put out, there's a lot on their plate.
Thank you, Philip. Any back there? Yes.
Yes, sir. You need the microphone.
Hi, I'm Sam Sachs. I forget your name, sir.
Dennis Rosenbaum.
Dennis, Mr. Rosenbaum. So you stated there's a couple issues that still remain, and you seem, I don't want to put words in your mouth, concerned that there's some serious issues that still remain, or that need to be worked out in the report. Can you tell us specifically what those are? What you're alluding to? What are those specific issues?
With the use of force patterns
Yeah.
that we talked about? Well, Tom, I think, has done a good job of articulating the various things that need to be done yet with regard to specific tasks for compliance when in the force section of the settlement agreement. This new analysis, it both is positive in that it confirms that mental health, which is the primary focus of the settlement agreement, is not people with mental health crisis, perceived or real, are not being given more levels of force than those. But when you do research like this, you discover things that nobody expected or knew about. And so I think there are some patterns in there with regard to demographics that the Bureau needs to think about why they exist. They may be other factors that aren't being measured with African American, Latinos, and others that we don't know about why a higher level of force, it might be justified, it might not be. But again, we're saying there's a responsibility, I think, to look at that. The transient issue, it might be justified, it might be not. I know Portland has, a lot of cities are concerned about people that are homeless, houseless, and whether that, a good chunk of the transients fall into that category. And I know that there's been recent discussion from the mayor's office and the auditor and others about looking at that issue of how the interaction between the police bureau and folks on the street. That may be, this is another interesting finding that there seems to be not just more arrests, as they point out, but there's a higher level of force being used with some of those folks. And it may be justified when you look into it. Maybe they just are completely. Now, we do measure resistance, and we control for that, and it's still an effect above and beyond that. So, but there may be other aspects of resistance that aren't being measured in the police report, or there may be, people standing around that own businesses that say, you've got to get this person moved now. I'm just saying that you need to look into it. And so, because I know that Jared's here from the U.S. Attorney's, the Department of Justice, and they're concerned, obviously, just the constitutionality of things in general, so that you make sure. And I think that sometimes this isn't intentional either. It's just a pattern or practice that is something that goes on over time that nobody is even aware of. So we don't know yet, yeah.
And one example of that is what the officer knows going into, or maybe not knows, but what the officer has, been told about the interaction that they're about to enter into. We can look at whether, the level of resistance by the community member. We can look at the demeanor of the community member, whether they're antagonistic or not. But one thing that can't be measured straightforward and very easily is, in terms of coding it and putting it into the data, is what the officer has been told about the situation. And that might be a potential other explanation. At this point, we wouldn't know that, though.
Another thing that I think the Bureau's being proactive about that looks good right now that I'm impressed with is they're starting up a new program of training on implicit bias that's going to go into effect in the fall. And I think that we're all biased, every one of us. We have research to document that now. But that they make the officers more aware of their own biases, but also how they interact with. We're biased in various ways by all demographics and different groups. And so the chief is very committed to that. And we've been pushing procedural justice, which is related to that, the ability of officers to listen to people and give them a voice and treat them with respect and dignity, and not judge them based on their demographics or anything like that. So, and I think they're really taking that stuff seriously now, and that was not the case in the year or two ago. And so, I'm optimistic that that could help too, if that is a problem here. I mean, it's a problem everywhere to some extent.
And I'm sorry to keep talking too, but like I had alluded to before, the concept of de-escalation has gone from command and control tactics of stop doing what you're doing or I'll tase you being considered de-escalation to now the Bureau putting out reminders, documents, and training to officers saying this is not de-escalation. De-escalation are these more verbal calming skills. So that's another step that we've seen that really kind of a step in the direction that we've been looking for.
I have three questions. One had to do with bivariate and multivariate. It just seems on the face of it that bivariate is useless, and I don't even know why can you justify even having used it at all.
So
It's so easy for people to make a causal connection. Oh, there's two variables, so they're going to jump to whatever easy conclusion that comes in their mind. Why waste anybody and the time and the effort and the money to even do that?
Want me to answer that?
either you or I.
You're making a really good point. I mean, it is overrated. There's no question about that. We've had our own discussions about that at lunch today. But in a research world, we tend to start there with the relationship between two variables, and then we go and look at it. If there's no relationship, we kind of stop looking. But if there's a relationship, then we get suspicious. Is it really a real relationship or not? And then we add all these other variables to control for it. It's like the ice cream thing. So, but no, we wouldn't start. But anyway, yeah, we're not going to disagree with you on that generally.
Okay, you said in the kind of summary part of the report where it came to a couple of things. One was, and I'm trying to remember the exact word you used. I think it was substantial compliance or commendable. You used the word commendable, which sounds to me very subjective. How and why would you come up with a term like that?
Well, we don't use that in our report. We might say that occasionally, that we think.
It was up there.
Yeah, was it?
It's that progress has been commendable. I don't think there's anything wrong with us saying that we commend the PPB and the city for the progress that has been made. Has it reached?
Recognized. Progress is recognized.
Progress is recognized.
I mean,
I hear-
commendable sounds very subjective and biased.
I hear what you're saying. I don't know that we use that word in our report. We talk more about whether it's substantial compliance or not. But yeah, we will certainly take that into consideration. I appreciate what you're saying. We don't want to sound biased. We do want to acknowledge the progress that's been made in the last year or two. When we first started this, 3.5, 4 years ago, whenever it was, I've lost track, there was a struggle. And there was resistance, as there is in other cities, to this kind of stuff. But the Bureau has really come around a long ways, and so we're trying to just acknowledge that. So there's still some distance to travel, but and in the end, when this is over, It's the responsibility of the community and the Bureau and everybody to work together to self-regulate these things. And we're trying to help them create, it's really and they're doing this, measurement systems that will hold themselves accountable and then be documentable to the public. So if you keep track of these things, then the public can say, well, how are you doing on these?
My last one, and I'm sorry to be taking this much time, but everything is important when you're dealing with human lives. So, I report. Now, I found it almost incredible to come to some kind of a conclusion that people with mental illness are not more harmed than the public at large. Now, maybe I'm just going from anecdotal evidence of what we see, actually in terms of video and news reports and read in the magazines and newspapers that there is something that you guys seem to correlate between use of force and resistance, active or passive or whatever, whereas what about the basic attitude of police toward houseless, homeless people in terms of maybe they just go into it. They see somebody that looks raggedy or dirty or has a shopping cart and automatically jump to some biased conclusion, not that the person necessarily did anything in terms of resistance. Next thing you know, they're in deep trouble because police grab their equipment and dump it and get rid of it. And sometimes there's medication that the person needs, and replacing even ID cards and that kind of thing it's a problem for you or me, but it could be real critical for a person who doesn't have hardly anything else. So how can you say or come to kind of conclusions that people experiencing mental health crisis aren't severely and much more often and unnecessarily harmed by police action?
Well, so let's be clear about what we are saying, that this is just an analysis of the existing police data set in force reports. And the fact that all we're saying is that they're not using a higher level of force when they encounter people with mental health issues than they are with people without them. That isn't to say that they aren't harmed by getting the same level of force as somebody else. They could be twice as harmed as you're implying. We're not saying that's not true. Just interacting with the police could be more harmful to people with mental illness. So that's a reality and they've done a lot of things to deal. We've talked about mental illness. That was our first report. Back to your point about the houseless issue, we're not debating what you're saying either, because in fact the data say there's some higher level of force being used with transients. Now, some have pointed out to us that not all transients are houseless, some of them are people living in someone's relative's house while they're visiting or whatever. But I suspect a substantial number of the transients are. But we don't know that. I don't have that data. But our point is that we don't know, and I think Portland is right now, as you know, dealing with this issue. And there'll be a lot of dialogue about this, and I'm confident that the Bureau is planning in its implicit bias and procedural justice training that starts in September will address not just bias by race and gender and stuff, but bias by class and by other factors like that you're suggesting. So not denying what you're saying, that could be the case.
And can I also, just to focus on a couple of things that you said that persons with mental illness having force used on them more often. Our evaluation can't look at that more often. We have a section in the report that talks about to do that would need a non-force companion data set to be able to look at how often is force being used compared with how often it is not being used. So our evaluation only looks at when force is used, what the category of force is. And, I'll go back to the controlling factors. When you have a person who has mental illness and a person without mental illness, if you are assuming that across both people, the level of resistance is the same, whether that's high or low resistance, across both people, whether they are in possession of a weapon, whether that's yes or no, if you're assuming that everything is equal between those two persons, then they will receive the same category of force. There's not a difference in between those when you assume that all of the other factors between them are equal.
Thank you. Anybody else? Thoughts? Oh.
Hi, I'm Dan Handelman with Portland Cop Watch. And just playing off what Mr. Barnett was talking to you about, you did not examine level 1 force. And if you look at the level 1 force that's happened since the DOJ came to town, almost every person that's been shot by the police has had a mental health problem. So I think it's really disingenuous for this report to leave out the most serious kind of force and not to look at that issue, because I think that must be part of what's going on in people's minds when they think that people who are houseless or have mental illness are subjected to higher levels of force, because they are more subjected to deadly force than the rest of the community. So that needs to be part of your analysis. When you put out your report a few months ago, I asked why you created a new category of rating, because there has always been minimal, partial, and substantial ratings, and now you have this substantial with caveats rating. And the psychological effect that I described of the Bureau looking at something and there's all they see is green is that they think they're done. And the community thinks, wow, I don't think they're done. I've seen a lot of problems still. So I think you should not be using this new system of ratings, especially this far into the game. I think you should keep it at partial or substantial ratings. Then I found the table, I can't remember which table it was, but there's a table where you're describing how often certain kind of people, males, females, people of different race are subjected to force, and the numbers on those pages add up to more than 100%, like every single one of them.
Can you
adds up to more than 100%.
page, Dan?
I'll find the page number in a minute, but the point is that Mel Brooks said you can't have more than 100% of anything, and that's true. So I don't know why that happened. Also, the numbers on that page, when you total the number of uses of force, one's 1943, one's 1944, and one's 1927, so they don't even add up to the same number of cases. So this is the kind of thing where it really seems like you need somebody proofreading your report for accuracy. So I'd like to hear responses to those. I have other issues, but I'll put the mic down for the time being.
Dan, can I ask, is it on page 63, table 14?
Highly unlikely, because I didn't make it to that part.
We'll certainly check that, Dan. I suspect, though, that we've been pretty careful, but it's possible there's typos in the tables, but the analysis is pretty careful, and sometimes there are row percentages and sometimes column percentages, so they don't always add up to 100%.
Page 51.
And while you're looking at that, Tom, I'll just respond. In terms of your first point, Dan, about level 1 force being left out, it was not included in this particular regression analysis because there were so few of those cases that it couldn't stand up in the analysis by itself, and if we combined it with the other data, it would maybe mess that up because psychologically and conceptually it's a more serious level of force. Now, having said that, I do appreciate your comment, the thrust of it, that we shouldn't necessarily ignore that. Now, we haven't ignored those very serious cases when it comes to the audit process and the review process and the systems that are set up. It's only in this particular analysis. So they have been considered. But your point is that and there's some benefit to doing kind of a case study of a small handful of cases. They do get a lot of the attention. They are really important to know that what happened there and why it happened and whether it was justified and constitutional within policy. And we have done some of that. DOJ has done some of that, I know. And there's cases, some of these cases, they don't fit into a statistical analysis, but they could fit into a case study analysis where you learn from that experience. And you've had a couple big cases in Portland, a big one this year, and so that, there's things that can be looked at about those. We did not comment on that. Now when there's active review and investigations, we prefer not to make comments or take a position on that. But anyway, I don't know if that, Tom, did you want to say anything else about okay. And about the table thing, you think there's an error there, or do you think?
Yeah, I'll have to
Check it again. Okay, so, and we always count on Dan to identify anything that's technically wrong as well as substantively, but technically he's been very helpful over the years.
Substantively too.
Substantively too, Dan, not just technically. Thank you. We're open to other comments, and down.
Yeah, more stuff.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. We should have known better that you're just getting started.
I was just at the Training Advisory Council meeting last night, and they talked about the quarterly force statistics that come out that they were presented, which the reports keep changing. And in your report, you suggested that they go back from showing raw numbers to showing just percentages of uses of force, which is something that came from the community. I don't think that's appropriate for you to override community concerns. I think you can suggest they put both in, but I don't think it's a good thing for you to say, don't listen to what the community asked for, because we want to see both. So, and that's kind of true. And your report kind of goes back and forth between raw numbers and percentages. And I think it's helpful to have both so you understand how big of a problem we're talking about when you're looking at these percentages. Sometimes, you yourself pointed out how, like the tasers, the number of taser uses looks like a lower percentage because they have added all these new kinds of force. But if you put the raw numbers across there, it would be easier to figure out if they're using tasers more from year to year. And on that note, both your reports and the reports, the use of force reports that the Bureau puts out, you're putting this dividing line between where they changed the 1010 reports and now, where 400 or more new kinds of force were reported. So it looks like the force is going off the charts. But I think, especially given that you're no longer managing the COAB and you're still being paid the same amount of money, that you should go through and pull out those other new kinds of force and have an ongoing long-term analysis of what kind of force was used, and then do a separate table starting from the 1010 change. And then that way it won't be so confusing and it won't look like the amount of force has jumped, and you can explain it. And I also don't buy the whole thing about the system changing in 2015. The DOJ came here in 2012, and we need to see whether there's been a change in use of force from the point of 2012 till now, because that's what we're looking for, right? How much has these changes affected what the police are doing? So I'd like to see you go all the way back to 2012 at least. Thank you.
So thank you, Dan. A couple quick comments about raw numbers. I'm not going to disagree with you that sometimes raw numbers are helpful. They do give you the ability to look at data differently and analyze things yourself sometimes. But they also suffer from, is it Mr. Barrett that, is that Barnett? I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Barnett said about things being misleading, and raw numbers are one of those things that are don't explain, usually when they're by themselves. They're not based on rates or probabilities. So, but I hear what you're saying about the community asking for this, so we can certainly look into that. And I trust that you'll give us a note about this type of analysis that you're interested in writing, so that we can, because I don't want to get into that right now, but there's some ambiguity around that, but that is certainly something we're happy to consider. Is that it, Dan, from you?
Well, I got more. Leaving room for other people to talk.
Okay. Anybody else, or no? Okay, go ahead.
So one of the things in the report you talked about, and you talked about this tonight too, that how the Bureau analyzes the individual cases for whether they met the Graham standard, but we have a Graham plus standard here. So it's a little disturbing that if that's where they leave it, whether it's within Graham or versus whether they're meeting the standards that we are trying to push our Bureau to meet.
Can I'll respond to that. So the Graham Plus standard is the policy, which means that there are additional things above Graham that the policy requires. So not only does the Bureau evaluate the Graham standard, but an officer could violate the policy without violating the Graham standard. The policy is the Graham Plus. It includes the Graham standard, but it also includes a number of other things that the officer could violate and that they'll be held accountable for. So that's where the Graham Plus comes.
Did he saying we're ignoring that? We're not really ignoring that.
No, again, the inspector, let me go through all of this fun stuff. The inspector does look at the Graham standard, but they also will look at other parts, the officer's risk assessment, the legal standing, post-custody, medical, calling in medical. So the officer does look at a number of things that above and beyond Graham.
Communication skills now are being evaluated, something we've been stressing all along, to avoid the use of force. And that's built into the training now, too. So that's a Graham Plus kind of thing.
Okay, so, and I do want to compliment a few things that you did. And you didn't really seize on this tonight.
Talk really slow.
Right.
Yeah. You didn't seize on this, but you mentioned it, that you need a data set of places where the Bureau didn't use force to compare the force cases to. But your report says several times the Bureau is starting to do that. And
Yes.
the Training Advisory Council talked about that last night, and none of them apparently read this report. I don't know if anybody else in Portland has read this report other than me, but we'll see about that. Yeah, no, that's a good thing, and I'm glad you brought that up. You also, you mentioned tonight that you're not going to let them get away with saying that if the officer fires a taser at somebody and the probe falls out, that doesn't count as applying the taser. That is, it's astonishing that that's how the commanders are looking at it. But that's as if they fired their gun and said, oh, well, there was no real discharge of firearm. No, there was a discharge of firearm. You just didn't hit the person. So, it's still a use of deadly force. So I appreciate you following that up.
Sorry, Dan. The non-force companion data set, that was something that the Bureau initiated as well. That was something because their data only went so far without that non-force data set. So I think we really want to make a mention of that because that will vastly expand the types of data analysis that they can do. So the positive praise on that, I think that was their initiative to do that.
Yeah, no, it's good. But you also, you mentioned it in the report. That's the only reason I know about it is because you mentioned it in the report. Okay, so here's a big question, which I don't know how you can account for it. But what happens if an officer uses force but doesn't report it? How would you ever know that? So we're only talking about the reported uses of force, and we may know, people in the community may have had a force experience, and they might not complain about it because they know nothing's going to happen. So how would you even know that this is actually reflecting all the force that's actually being used out there?
We don't, for sure. We're trusting that most of these officers have some integrity and that they're doing what they're hired and trained to do as professionals. However, given all the issues in law enforcement today nationwide, myself personally, I have recommended here and elsewhere that police wear body-worn cameras. So that's my response.
And when we go to do the accountability report as well, I think one thing that may be responsive to you that we can look at is the number of force complaints that get made by community members which don't have associated FDCRs. I don't know how often that happens. I don't know if that happens. It's definitely something that we can look at that I think would address that concern of yours, but like Dr. Rosenbaum said, we don't know. It's a valid question.
Okay, this is Philip here, and I'm a former member of COAB. So I'm not an analyst on this. I'm not a statistician, so all of these numbers, thank you, Dan, for your work on all of this. I was reading some of this, and I was noticing with some of the comparisons here on page 22 it is, de-escalation, what's not de-escalation, what is considered de-escalation, and I found that very interesting. One thing that came up, and this is not necessarily related to the report, but something that I did want to, I just wanted to voice a concern for, future thoughts on this, and something that I feel isn't right, and I've had personal experience with. One line here says, if a person who is Latino, or excuse me, Spanish, if there is a Spanish-speaking person and an officer who does not speak Spanish, I just want to raise this issue, and having an officer who speaks Spanish to facilitate a conversation, having that not be a code of ethics issue, that would be a code of ethics issue, excuse me, because when you need to bring an outside interpreter in who can facilitate that communication between Spanish and English, and you don't want to have somebody who is both roles as an interpreter and as an officer facilitating that communication. I've had that experience with ASL, American Sign Language, and I've asked for an ASL interpreter, and they've had an officer come in, and they decided to have another officer come in who knew some basic sign language and thought that was qualified enough to facilitate the communication that was happening there. And when I see the statement in the report, it raises concerns for me. So I did want to address that.
Philip, are you suggesting that that it's the need for an interpreter and sign language, that those two interact sometimes and it's not just one or the other?
Okay.
A language
I need to clarify
Yeah.
de-escalation. So say a person is speaking Spanish and they have an officer come over who also speaks Spanish to help with that communication facilitation. I feel like that's inappropriate and should be a policy violation, because that they should not be a language facilitator as just an officer. They need to hire a professional, an outside professional to come in, and officers should not be having dual roles in that situation as officers and as interpreters. Is that clear?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
I know it's not related to what's in the report. I just wanted to point that out so it could be addressed in future versions. I think that's it's a serious issue and could be dangerous. And for an officer to be involved as an interpreter, maybe that person is a victim or whoever is watching that interpreter who is also an officer. There could be bias involved. There could be undue loss of neutrality, and they're not certified to be in that role. So I do think it's important. And I do have a second comment that it just came to mind. So in fall, there'll be the implicit bias training. Are you addressing racism in that? I've noticed the use of the word bias as kind of a front for the word, and it's not really calling out racism. And I think that's a huge issue in the police community all over America, all over the country. Against black and brown people are being killed more and more now. And I think that's a bigger issue at this current time. So is racism going to be in that implicit bias training?
The answer is yes. We've already addressed that with the Bureau, and they have every intention of covering race as a central part of that in the fall in service on implicit bias. The other issue of needing a professional interpreter, first I want to acknowledge that a police officer and someone else who's speaking another language, that does escalate increases the risk that there could be misunderstanding, which can lead to problematic escalation. We can give examples of that. But your recommendation that the Spanish interpreter in that example has to be a professional rather than another officer who speaks Spanish, I'm not an expert on that issue, but I will say that just understanding police and what they do, that you're talking about adding a lot of extra time when there may be an officer immediately available, and it could be an escalating situation or a very dangerous situation that may require an immediate response. And secondly, that's an added cost, a substantially added cost to the taxpayer, because there's a lot of Spanish-speaking people in
No.
Portland and in other situations. So it's just something to weigh in on.
And I'll also
We can talk about it a little bit more in depth, but I disagree with that. It should not be about monetary concerns, financial concerns. It's access. And that's the most important point, is access, and focusing on providing equitable access to people. I think cost, we can talk more about it later, but access and equal access to skilled and fluent communication. I think if there's unskilled communication, I think that becomes escalation. I mean, if the person is already on the payroll, you have an officer already on the payroll and you pull them into this other position, I think with any other language, that would be an issue. And I understand the issue of time. It is an officer's job to work through the protocols and how to find the appropriate resources, pulling in an interpreter when appropriate. And in my experience as a victim, as an ex-abuser, I was victimized by police as well when they failed to provide me an ASL interpreter. And having this here as a de-escalation technique, that really hits home for me, and I want to put that warning out there. It's a big concern.
Philip, I'll also say on page 15, we provide our assessment of 68B, looking at a warning for 68B particular to CEWs. PPB has gone above and beyond that and has required a warning for all force, but also where there is a language barrier, the officer shall attempt to utilize hand signals. We've seen that discussed in training. Our review of reports, I can't think of one off the top of my head where there was a language barrier, so in terms of actual on-the-street application, I don't have an example for you. But what we have seen that put into training, and there are a number of nonverbal de-escalation techniques that the officer may be able to use. Not only hand signals to convey the message, but there's a number of other nonverbal de-escalation techniques that might be used as well.
So I'm sorry, is that training is provided by who? Is it an able-bodied individual who does not know sign language and is trying to figure out what the facial expressions look like? Who sets up what that system looks like? Who is teaching in those trainings?
I don't believe the training was specific to ASL.
Sorry to draw it on.
I'm sorry?
Okay. Yeah, we can talk more about it later. I know Dan has a lot more that he would like to talk about as well.
I can't believe that.
I've got a comment.
Sure.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I have a comment from a community member named Ada. So she texted me a comment. She's watching the live stream tonight. She wrote to me, concerns and comments. I would like to see more detailed targets versus ambiguity on goals of compliance and what goals are being achieved currently versus what will occur in the future. As I read the report, it sounded like PPB was not responsible in some areas. I also have concerns on data collection and judgments used by non-professional staff versus professional providers, i.e. number 99, concerning report writing. So that's Ada's comment.
That relates to the mental health report, paragraph 99. So without that report in front of me or without the presentation, I'm not necessarily sure how to respond. If Ada, if Ada would like to send an email or something that we'd be able to respond to. The mental health report has been finalized, but I think we'd be very happy to respond in writing to that.
Great, thank you, Tom. Thank you very much.
We have 15 more minutes. I'm wondering, you've wanted to speak here for a while, and then I know Dan will have more as well.
This is a little 101, sorry, but could you just give us your working definition of the Graham standard and how it guides your analysis in this? Do you have a gram plus standard that you use in these reports, or do you go off of the bureaus?
You want to respond to that?
I mean, the Graham standard is a legal a legal requirement. It looks at the totality, the reasonableness of the force event under the totality of the circumstances. You can't quantify all the circumstances that might be. Some of them are the severity of the crime, the resistance of the subject, presence of a weapon. Those are all things that would influence the totality of the circumstances to look at whether the force is reasonable. But there's no hardened. You can't create a code to determine Graham.
It's fundamentally subjective.
And it's
There is a set of conditions that Graham specifies about the seriousness, the immediate threat to life, and all of that the audit does go through to make sure that all of these matters were covered when they justified that force. I mean, Graham Plus, we have not talked much about that in the Bureau. There's kind of a national effort coming out of the Police Executive Research Forum and their 20 principles or whatever it was they put out a year ago or 2 years ago to try to push the field beyond Graham. And the International Association of Chiefs of Police pushed back. So there's been kind of a dialogue about that. From our own, in answer to your question, do we have our own Graham Plus ideas? I mean, one of the ones that we've pushed throughout this period has been the procedural justice and the de-escalation definitions that are more modern. And so, this idea that, force after it's been initiated is oftentimes justified, legitimately so, by the Constitution. You have someone who's threatening you and meeting those Graham standards. But we want to know how you got to that point. And we want to know whether it was absolutely necessary for you to get to that point, and whether it was all caused by that person and you did everything in your power to communicate to this person in other ways that are not threatening, that are recognizing their voice, treating them with respect and dignity, all these things that are central, that we now know from lots of research, contribute to people's cooperation and voluntary compliance in hundreds of studies across 6 different countries. So our Graham Plus idea is that you look at the front end, and they're doing that now. We've been talking about that for 2 years, but the Portland Police Bureau is starting to do that. The inspector and now the training. So it may be a long time before it has an impact or it's spread throughout the whole organization, and I know the new chief believes in that. So that's one of our ideas of what Graham Plus means, because Graham justifies force after the fact.
So I can also, I'll give an example of how the PPB policy is Graham Plus, and I will look over here. You can correct me if I'm misquoting the directive, but in the directive, you cannot use more than one CEW simultaneously on a person unless deadly force would be justified. Is that a good summary? It may not be the exact language. However, that is Graham Plus, because under a Graham evaluation, it could be reasonable, it could not be reasonable. PPB has said, no, you will not do this unless lethal force would also be justified. So that's that Graham Plus, where under Graham, you're just looking at the reasonableness of the force. With that, you can't do it unless there are these other circumstances. That's part of the Graham Plus.
The issue that you raised about homeless, houseless people and the people listed as transients in the various reports, I'm glad that you identified that they are subjected to force at a higher rate than the rest of the community. What's left out of probably the IPR's analysis and the Oregonians is that just the basic use of force reports show that 44% of the uses of force are against people listed as transients, which just by itself, that's off the charts. They say 52% of the arrests are of transients, according to Oregonians' analysis. So I think that it's good. I think you need to dig deeper into that. I'm glad that you started looking into it, though.
Can I respond to that again, though, too? Using higher force rate, that would require the companion force data set to be able to say the rate. Are the finding of transient was that first force application when force is used, the category, not whether there's a higher rate.
We just don't know that.
Right, without the companion non-force data set looking at force more often or a higher force rate we can't do that.
Right, but one of the factors you're not looking at is the percentage of the population. Only 3% of Portlanders are houseless. So 44% of the force is used against 3% of the population. There's something wrong, just based on that. You mentioned that the police are starting to train not to use force against people who just show contempt of cop, and I use that term in the report. And that's something that we've heard about for many, many years at Cop Watch. I think that's great, but then you used just now the term antagonistic, and it just seems to me that unless you clarify that could be, the police think contempt of cop is when you assert your rights. When you say, am I free to go? They think that that's contemptuous and antagonistic, even though you're just asserting your constitutional right. So I think you should be careful about how you use the words antagonistic. And on that same note, when you're talking about the levels of resistance that police are trying to overcome, allegedly, you should recognize that a lot of times the police will start screaming out to, when they're trying to take a person to the ground, stop resisting, when the person's not resisting, but just to get the witnesses around to think the person's resisting. So you should refer to it as the reported level of resistance rather than the level of resistance, because we don't know what actually the level of resistance was. It's just what the officer wrote down.
Thank you, Dan. Those are some good points. And I think the word antagonistic from the Bureau's reports, or is that us?
I'm looking at the methodology right now.
Yeah, well, we'll check that. We'll check that.
Just one last thing. Philip was looking at those these little sheets that the Bureau put together about de-escalation, and the first one is just a confused mess, and I hope that the Bureau gets rid of it because it is contradictory, and it tells officers essentially to use kind of a threat, and that can be seen as a de-escalation, even though the second one explicitly says when you use a threat, that's not de-escalation. So I'd like to see them kind of get rid of the first document or re-edit it and put it all out as one clear document. The second was much better and much clearer. And on that note, though, we've been talking about this for a long time, and you have very well articulated that the police think de-escalation is both when they say, hey, can I offer you a cigarette, and that takes the tension out of the air so they don't use force, and after they start punching on somebody and then they go and then they just twist their arm a little bit, they think that's de-escalation also. If you use different words, they won't get confused about what it means. So we said that it should be, the second thing should be called mitigation of force, where you're getting to a lower level of force after you've already used it. And the other thing is de-escalation. I think that'd be much clearer if people start just using different terms. You won't be confused.
Thanks, Dan. Anybody else? We have another 5 minutes.
Okay, so you mentioned that we had a pretty serious use of deadly force this quarter, but you didn't say John Ellifritz's name, and I just need to say his name into the record, and that I think you were here right after that happened last time. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And the community's upset about that, and that there was a person in mental health crisis that was surrounded by 12 armed officers and 8 unarmed or officers who weren't using their weapons. And he was shot to death within 37 seconds of the officers entering a houseless shelter, a sacred religious-based ministry for people who are trying to turn their lives around. And I think it would be well worth saying something about it, even though I know you don't want to comment on whether or not they followed all the procedures that are listed in the report.
Well, I'm going to stick to the fact that we're not going to say anything about it. I feel that we will when the time is right, and that if it ties into our responsibility here as it relates to complying with the standards that have been established in the settlement agreement. And there, as you can speculate, there's some of the principles that we've articulated that would be relevant to the review of that case. But, we're going to wait till we hear all the facts. And again, videotapes are important. That's why body-worn cameras would be helpful in Portland in general, in my view. I know they're expensive and they raise lots of questions, but they also address a lot of things. And they're generally been shown. I know that, Dan, you sometimes disagree with us on this, but they generally have been helpful, I believe, in American policing. So, but that was a tragedy, and it's like, I know it's under review right now, and we will comment on it when we can. I do think that, as I said earlier, and as you pointed out about the deadly force cases, there are, aside from statistical analysis, I mean, each has its benefit. The statistical approach gives you the pattern and the trends that are not the exception. There's what the average police officer does most of the time. There will always be exceptions. There will be some screw-ups. There will be things that happen. Those are, by doing a case study of those, you can learn a lot. And there's a whole science to that as well. So not ruling out that as I'm sure Portland's going to go through various stages of this and figure out, and they will be honest, hopefully everyone will be honest with themselves about that situation and whether it was handled the right way or not. But we're not going to comment on it now because we don't have, it would prejudice us. We're trying to stick to the facts that we know right now, and we don't know enough to take a position on it at this point.
I have a question. When you're measuring police interaction with people who are experiencing a mental health crisis or who have a mental illness, either or, how can that evaluation be assessed? So if there is someone else, let's say a superior, who is observing the officer, making notes, or is the police officer themselves submitting notes, how is that evaluation coming about? And how are they evaluating their interaction? I personally think that that is flawed, because if they have someone who is not supervising them, they only have themselves to answer to. If they have a supervisor on site, then of course they may change their behavior. Just like taking a training, they'll act more accordingly, but out in the real world, they don't have any supervision on site and they can behave in a completely different manner. So I'm wondering, how does that evaluation give any factual evidence? Can you give me more information about that?
Well, if you're raising questions about the credibility of the police reports, that again, I'll go back to my body-worn camera thing. But secondly, the Bureau has recently revised their force report to include a lot more detail to require officers to answer all the Graham questions and answer all the other details about what really happened. They didn't have that before. They just wrote a narrative, and now they have to do a lot of answering questions and write about it. So it's a much more detailed data collection effort. But if, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll also say with the force audit, if there is information within the officer's narrative that indicate mental illness, and the officer did not mark that, there's a system in place set up through the force audit for the analyst to to look at that and say, the question may be asked, was this a mistake that this was marked no? But there's that double checking through that force audit aspect as well.
Hi, Sam Sachs again. We have 1 minute, so I was just listening to everything, and I was thinking, because I used to work in the jails for 6 years when Multnomah County, when Damas shut down. And when Damas shut down, we had a big influx of mental health patients or people with mental health. But we never got any training on how to deal or evaluate or assess mental health. So this may already be known, but I'm not sure. What kind of training do just your everyday police officers have or get to make that evaluation and assess what is a mental health condition? Because there are people, we're surrounded by people every day that have mental health issues, but you wouldn't know it, or unless they identify or say to you, I have a mental health issue. So, and this may already be known, forgive me, but what is the training or the process that they have, the tool that they have to evaluate mental health issues when they're out there?
It's an extremely good question. It's something that's being discussed elsewhere too. So with the Bureau, all officers receive 40 hours of crisis intervention training. Then they also have their specialized officers who receive an additional 40 hours. I will say I've had discussions with people on the CIT International Board of Directors who also have identified that CIT training for officers is only one part of the equation. Having creating and developing training for corrections, creating and developing training for AMR ambulance. There's a lot of areas of the criminal justice system which can receive that training. It hasn't been widely developed. It hasn't been widely implemented. In terms of police officers, it's been much more widely disseminated there. Right, having a co-responder model with the BHRT, but applying it and integrating it into other areas of the criminal justice system is something that's needed. So you're not going to hear any argument as to it's something that needs to be applied elsewhere. Yes.
Yeah, big problem. Well, thank you very much. I think we need one other.
Mandy has one more.
Thank you. Just one more comment from Ada. I might have a partial answer to this question, but I would also like the two of you to respond. So let's see. Ada asks, what audits are being completed to address unmet needs for community service treatment, expansion of work with peers, and oversight to see why some follow through with training is lacking? And she says by unmet needs, she means people not falling through the cracks and getting treatment in the community. I know this is about mental health, and we're here to talk about use of force tonight, but settlement agreement is about mental health. I will say that the county has recently done, I don't know if they're calling it an audit, it was Commissioner Sharon Myron, but they have completed an assessment of mental health services, at least at the county level. So I know that's out there. But if you two could speak to anything else that's going on that's addressing what Ada's speaking to. Thank you.
I do know that report. I do know that report has recently been put out. I've kind of glanced at the summary of it, but I haven't read it fully. Again, without being prepared really to answer that question, and without kind of having a better understanding of exactly where what that's seeking, what the question is seeking, I would reiterate the offer of if we'd be able to have an email exchange. I don't think there's any issue with being able to respond and providing a full answer.
Because there's a number of services the city provides as well, and also for repeat contacts. with the criminal justice system and the program. What's the name of it, Tom? I'm blanking on that.
With service coordination?
Yes, service coordination.
Yeah.
Service coordination team. But anyway, we'll add more to that. Thank you. Those are good questions, though. Well, thank you all for coming. We don't want to keep you past the promised time much more than the 5 minutes we've used up already. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
again, you have until the first of the month, feel free to email us or contact and add anything further that you want to about the report. We appreciate it.
Probably the second of the month, to be honest.
Second of the month, yeah, sorry. Okay, have a good evening. Thanks.
Thank you.